Hello everyone, this is lecture 3 for chapter 8, the muscle system that aligns with the whole essentials of anatomy and physiology. And today we're going to talk about energy sources for muscle contraction. So muscles, as we saw in the last video, a muscle fiber must have ATP in order to contract. ATP as a molecule is made by the mitochondria in the cell through aerobic respiration. It can also be made through anaerobic respiration. ATP, in terms of like stability, like it's not a very long-lived molecule. If you say the muscles can't just store up a great quantity of ATP and just let it stockpile, because over time that high energy bond on the third phosphate will just degenerate on its own. So the ATP, there are processes in place in the muscle to continually replenish the supply of ATP from glucose or other starting molecules. Glucose is the main one. Once the initial supply of ATP is used up and it's broken down into ADP and inorganic phosphorus, muscles do have a molecule called creatine phosphate that can directly phosphorylate the ADP. So it can take the energy from the creatine phosphate, regenerate the ATP so that it can be used for further muscle contraction. Creatine phosphate is a little bit longer shelf life than ATP, so it can be stored up, separately. So if there's enough ATP, there is an enzyme, it's called creatine phosphokinase, that promotes making more creatine phosphate. Okay. However, if the muscle is undergoing, a lengthy contraction, or if there's, exercise going on, then once the initial supply of ATP is used up, and then once the supply of creatine phosphate that regenerates ATP, once that is used up, then the cells must turn back to regular old cellular respiration to generate new supplies of ATP. And so here's the diagram. So if ATP is high in high amounts in the cell, then ATP will be used to make creatine phosphate. But if ATP becomes too low, then the creatine phosphate will be used to make ATP. So it's a cycle, it goes back and forth. So if cellular respiration has to be relied on, this is a slower process, okay? Muscles use a lot of energy and they need it fast. That's why we have the ATP-CP process. But as a backup, we need to regenerate those supplies through cellular respiration. So cellular respiration has several stages. So the first stage is glycolysis. Glycolysis is anaerobic because it does not use any oxygen whatsoever. We're not going to get as in depth into this process as you did in your biology classes. But glycolysis yields 2 ATP molecules net per molecule of glucose. It actually makes 4 gross, but you need to put in 2 ATP molecules to begin with. So net, there's 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. It's not a very efficient process if that's all you're doing. The byproducts will eventually build up and get turned into lactic acid. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, if oxygen is present, the byproduct of glycolysis, besides the ATP, is 2 molecules of something called pyruvate. The pyruvate can then go to the mitochondria, where it can break down further in the presence of oxygen, and that process will yield a net of 28 ATP per molecule of glucose. Now, this process does require oxygen, so we haven't yet covered this in the class, but how oxygen gets to the cells is we breathe it in through our lungs. It gets put into the cardiovascular system and through the capillaries in the lungs, and it's carried in the red blood cells on molecules of hemoglobin. And from there, that hemoglobin carries the oxygen to the muscle tissue. Now, because muscle tissue needs such high quantities of ATP, it has its own special oxygen storage molecule called myoglobin, myo for muscle, globin, it's in the same family as the hemoglobin proteins. So the myoglobin will store up extra oxygen in muscle tissue specifically to be used in muscle respiration to increase yields of ATP more quickly. If you are out of shape, your body, your muscles don't have high quantities of myoglobin because you're not using them regularly. So that's why a lot of sports, they usually start with conditioning first. And part of that conditioning is one, making more myoglobin in your muscles, and two, making more mitochondria in your muscles as well. The more mitochondria you have, the better able you are to regenerate ATP. And that would translate into being in better shape. Okay, so here's a very brief diagram of cellular respiration. So this whole item is a cell, and then this here is a cross-section of a mitochondria. So inside the cytoplasm of the cell, that's where glucose gets broken down into the 2-ATP and pyruvic acid, also called pyruvate. And then if oxygen is present, the pyruvate will go to the mitochondria. It'll go through the rest of aerobic respiration. It'll go through the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle and go through oxidative phosphorylation, and it will make a large amount of ATP. But if oxygen is not present, the pyruvate naturally breaks down into lactic acid, and that's going to cause a problem for the cell. So if you're resting, or if you're only doing moderate activity where you're switching up which muscles you're using, then we typically have enough oxygen available for that to support aerobic respiration. But if you're doing a more strenuous exercise, you may develop oxygen deficiency to that muscle. Not as in you're going to pass out, and have problems, but like that muscle will run out of oxygen. And this can happen even during the first minute or two of a strenuous exercise. Like if you're sprinting or swimming or something like that. So what will happen, since there is no oxygen, pyruvic acid forms as a result of glycolysis, and then it will react with other items in the cell, and it's going to form lactic acid, which will break down into a lactate ion. That lactate ion will diffuse out of your muscle cells into your bloodstream and get carried to your liver. And at that point, your liver has to use ATP to actually reconvert that lactate ion back into a glucose molecule. That whole process takes time, and it must happen. Okay, like if it doesn't happen, you've got problems. That would, be liver failure. Okay. So as you're exercising, the more and more you're exercising, you're going to build up more and more lactate. As that lactate builds up, this is called having an oxygen debt. It must be repaid. It does take oxygen to redo. So that's why after strenuous exercise, you need to breathe deeply, you feel, tired, you need to rest because you're paying back this oxygen debt. This is the amount of oxygen that your liver cells must use to convert the lactate back into glucose, plus all the oxygen that your muscle cells need to use to resupply their ATP levels, and also creatine phosphate. Sometimes the oxygen debt is called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. This can take several hours. However, through conditioning and physical training, This does help increase an individual muscle's capacity to improve on its energy production and energy efficiency. This also takes time, okay? Conditioning won't just happen in a day. It's actually very bad practice to just, run until you puke, or, do vigorous exercises until you puke. That's bad, okay? It takes time. There is no free lunch. There's no easy ticket. If you want to get into shape, you need to spend time every day doing aerobic exercise as well as, weight training. Okay. Now, turning glucose into ATP is actually quite wasteful from an energy standpoint. Only about half of that chemical energy is harnessed by the cells and used to make ATP, and it's the ATP that powers the cell. That's why the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. All the rest of the energy from that chemical reaction is heat. Heat gets transported around your body by your bloodstream. So that's why if you have poor circulation, you tend to have colder hands and feet. But it's this heat that makes us as humans warm-blooded. We're able to maintain a constant internal body heat. Okay, and actually, if you get too cold, you shiver. It's an involuntary reflex of your muscle system. If you become cold, you shiver, which is all of your muscles contracting and relaxing, simultaneously. And the byproduct of that releases heat to help warm you up. However, sometimes with strenuous exercise, your muscles become fatigued. And fatigue, it means tired. So your muscle actually literally loses the ability to contract. It cannot do anymore. You could test this out if you, say, held your palm up and your arm out straight in front of you, and you put a book on your hand and you just hold it there. Give it long enough and your arm's actually going to fall. It may take a few minutes or it may take 10 minutes depending on what kind of shape you're in, but continuing to contract the same muscle for a long time uses up all the ATP and the muscle will become fatigued. It's actually still being studied as to the exact chemical reason for this. We used to always say, oh, it's the lactic acid building up in your muscle. It's causing the cytoplasm to become acidic, and that stops all of the chemical reactions in the sliding filament model from working. But now the research on that is unclear. So we're looking at it, scientists are looking at it from kind of a more holistic point of view. And they think it might have more to do with the lactic acid causing an imbalance of electrolytes, which is your ions, your calcium ions, sodium, potassium ions, and also the low levels of ATP. Now, sometimes your muscles will cramp, and this is a sustained involuntary muscle contraction. So you literally cannot relax your muscle, and it is painful. And we think that this is also due to the changes in the extracellular fluid and that it's related to muscle fatigue. So it's leading to uncontrolled muscle fiber stimulation by the motor neurons. A cramp just takes time to recover. It helps if you stretch it out physically and massage it physically. I've heard home remedies. Some people swear, people on track and field swear by drinking pickle juice. But that's really, it's just anecdotal evidence. It can't hurt you if you like to drink pickle juice. Some people say drink milk, but you're just going to have to wait it out. But the massage and stretching will help. The better shape you're in, the better conditioning you're in, the less likely it is you're going to get muscle cramps. That's the end for this section.